theme in this festival of ideas is, quote, the power of. And this talk explores the power of mountains, and particularly that of the Apennine range of mountains in Italy, upon the imaginations of those who travelled over them and wrote about them from the Middle Ages to modern times. Here we have a narrow point on what's called the roof of Italy, the Apennine Ridge near Abetone, which was part of the route I walked in 2002. The Apennines form what Dante, back in the 14th century, described as the roof of Italy. They run along most of the length of the peninsula, and many of the major rivers, such as the Arno, flow down from them. For those travelling between northern Italian cities, such as Milan and Bologna, to central and southern ones, such as Florence and Rome, this chain of peaks of the Apennines, rising to over 2,000 metres, presents a formidable barrier to be crossed by road or later by rail. The ridge of mountains between Bologna and Florence runs roughly from southeast to northwest and is crowned by a long-distance hiking trail, the Great Apennine Excursion, or GEA, as the Italians call it. The GEA runs along about a third of the whole Apennine Ridge and follows most of the northern border of Tuscany. It leads through dense woods of beech, pine, oak, sycamore, chestnut, and over high passes. It climbs a number of peaks, such as this one, the 2,000-metre Monte Prado. It visits several ancient religious sites, such as the Franciscan sanctuary of La Verna, on the summit of which, as you can see from this 13th century painting, on the summit of which St. Francis is said to have received the stigmatization, the marks of Christ's crucifixion. And it passes by holy lakes that feed the rivers that run down to Modena and to Parma. The trail also leads through high pastures, once grazed by flocks brought up in the summer by shepherds from the west coast, and past ancient highland villages, many of them now abandoned or given over to holiday homes. My own relationship with this trail began in the 1990s, when I noticed a poster on the wall of a refuge near Monte Prado, that 2,000-metre peak that I've already mentioned. The poster was advertising the route of the Great Apennine Excursion, which had been established a few years earlier. This route had been inaugurated by the great Italian mountaineer Reinhold Messner, who by then had climbed all the 8,000-metre peaks. For Messner, these relatively modest mountains carried powerful cultural and historical resonances. And in his preface to the Trail's Italian guidebook, he writes that, quote, "Through walking this route, we found ourselves plunged into an environment that I thought had disappeared. Everything looked as it must have done to the eyes of St. Francis. St. Francis, like the Buddha, had found through walking a perfect form of meditation and had shown people a way through which they could live in harmony with their environment." Amongst the many medieval travellers who crossed this route were pilgrims and clerics, such as the 10th century Archbishop of Canterbury, and monks from far afield, as far afield as Cluny, St. Albans, and Iceland. Amongst the Italians in the Middle Ages, Dante frequently crossed the Apennines in the course of the last 2 decades of his life, when he was in exile from Florence. roughly 1300 to 1320, and these mountains feature a number of times in Dante's Divine Comedy. In the 16th century, the French essayist and philosopher Michel de Montaigne came to know the mountains and their passes as he travelled through Italy in search of, quote, new and unknown things. By the 17th century, the so-called academic pilgrimage had become a pursuit for leisured intellectuals, and among those visiting Italian centres of learning and culture at that time was the English poet John Milton. Milton's Italian journey in the late 1630s would have led him across the Apennines, but he left no record of his impressions of them, apart from a couple of evocative references to nearby Fiesole and Vallombrosa, the convent. Like most travellers of his time, Milton was probably relieved to have got over the mountains, which the diarist John Evelyn in 1645 described as, quote, the dreadful ridge of the Apennines. Increasingly then, through the 18th century and on into the 19th century, such ridges, mountain peaks and ranges came to exercise power upon the imaginations of travellers, writers and explorers. Books such as recently Robert Macfarlane's Mountains of the Mind and Fergus Fleming's Killing Dragons, The Conquest of the Alps, have traced the history of this fascination among explorers of other mountain ranges. Over the same period, we can find comparable attitudes among those who, for various reasons, found themselves crossing and responding to the Apennines. And here now are a few brief examples of familiar and less familiar writers who feature more fully in my recent book, Apennine Crossings, Travellers on the Edge of Tuscany. So by the late 18th century, these rugged landscapes had changed from being, in Evelyn's words, quote, dreadful and a mere inconvenience to travellers, to becoming subjects of intense scientific and artistic interest. One of the most notable travellers to Italy in the late 18th century period was the German poet, dramatist and polymath Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Goethe's journey to Italy in 1786 came quite early in his career and was undertaken for a variety of reasons, including the urge to visit Rome. Goethe was thus in something of a hurry to cross the Apennines, but this did not prevent him, as geologist as well as poet, from closely observing some striking features of the landscape. In the foothills outside Bologna, he loaded his pockets with specimens of the strange luminescent Bologna stone. And as his journey took him over the ridge towards Florence, he was impressed and somewhat puzzled by the Apennines, which he saw composed of, quote, a bizarre weave of mountain ridges at odd angles to each other, where you often can't see which way the water runs off. An impression also conveyed in an engraving by an English artist only a few years later in 1792. This is John Warwick Smith's engraved sketch of the Apennine ridge. Goethe also showed an interest in the human imprint on the Apennine landscape, such as the cultivation of chestnuts and wheat. And this was shared by later travellers who spent longer in the region and visited some of its ancient religious sites. One of these travellers was the British baronet and antiquarian Sir Richard Colt Hoare. Sir Richard's journey across the Apennines in 1791, a few years after Goethe, took place near the end of several years of wandering on the continent, seeking, quote, new scenes and new occupations to detach my mind from melancholy reflections. These followed the death of his young wife. Hoare was drawn to remote places, like the sanctuary of Laverna, by a peculiar desire to visit monastic establishments. And here is a view of Laverna from the route I took back in 2001. Sir Richard Colt Hoare, back in 1791, was also impressed, he says, by, quote, those scenes where nature exhibits her original and undisguised character, scenes which furnish gratification to the eye and employment to the pencil. His eye for wild scenery is evident in his own sketches of Italian landscapes. Unfortunately, any drawings he may have made of the Apennines have not survived, but his descriptions of them often focus vividly on their effect upon the viewer. Here, for instance, is his response to reaching the summit of Monte Falterona, a 1,600-metre peak overlooking the source of the Arno and the valley of the northern Tuscan Casentino. Quote, I reached the highest point of this chain of Apennines called Falterona. In addition to the extensive view, this exalted pinnacle overlooked the province of Mugello and the city of Florence. The whole length of the valley of the Casentino also discloses itself. On these airy heights, the mind, expatiating over the world which expands beneath, feels the inspiring influence of local elevation. 3 years earlier, the Swiss conqueror of Mont Blanc, Horace de Saussure, had written similarly about a view in the Alps. I quote from him, quote, the soul is uplifted, the powers of intelligence seem to widen, and in the midst of this majestic silence, one seems to hear the voice of nature. Both Saussure in the Alps and Sir Richard Colt Hoare in the Apennines thus seem to foreshadow the romantic association of mountainous heights with extended vision. That same romantic fascination would be demonstrated by a well-known literary couple who spent time in the Apennines some 30 years later. The poet Percy Shelley and his partner, the novelist Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. In her later edition of her husband's work, Mary Shelley recalled how, quote, during some of the hottest days of August 1820, Shelley made a solitary journey on foot to the summit of Monte San Pellegrino, a mountain of some height, on the top of which there is a chapel, the object during certain days of the year of many pilgrimages. Mary Shelley, like some other editors of the poet, also thought that the poet's long excursion, some 70 kilometres each way and 1,500 metres of ascent, may have inspired the imaginary landscape of one of Shelley's longer poems. Whether he actually completed the climb or not, it would have fed Shelley's fascination with mountains. 4 years earlier, he had visited the alpine landscape around Chamonix, and in a long letter written from there, he had described peaks, including Mont Blanc, whose immensity staggers the imagination, he said. And he would also evoke the, quote, green Apennine, islanded in the immeasurable air, in several of his later poems. And this is something of the view that he might have seen if he reached the top of Monte San Pellegrino. Mary Shelley, too, drew upon the idea of mountain pilgrimage in her novel Valperga, which is partly set in the Apennine Valley that the Shelleys spent time in. Her appreciation of the varied landscape and the human imprint upon it is reflected in a letter she wrote soon after arrival in the Apennine foothills near Lucca. I quote, we are surrounded by mountains covered with thick chestnut woods. They are peaked and picturesque, and sometimes you see peeping above them the bare summit of a distant Apennine. You can either walk by the side of the river or on commodious paths cut in the mountains. And for ramblers, the woods are intersected with narrow paths in every direction. In a final modern example, however, I want to acknowledge that this landscape was not seen as quite so idyllic by those who were destined either to work its soil or to engage in armed conflict across its steep slopes. During the closing years of World War II, the final line of German defence in Italy ran from coast to coast along this same section of the Apennines. Those destined to struggle in battle over the mountains here were the Allied and German combatants on the Gothic Line front, the Italian partisans behind the lines, and the escaped prisoners of war during 1944 to 1945. A famous escape narrative set in this region is, of course, Eric Newby's Love and War in the Apennines, which is highly recommended. But there were also others who wrote about their experiences in the war at this time. Amongst them was a South African poet, Guy Butler, who deserves rather more of a hearing as a writer about the war. Butler's later autobiography, titled The Bursting World, describes his participation in the Allied campaign across the Apennines and the attempt to break through into Lombardy during the last winter of the war, 1944-5. One of Butler's poems of this time itself, of 1944, is called Letter from Monte Stanco, and it describes a battle during that rainy autumn of 1944 in the midst of the Apennine Mountains. Quote, the chestnuts red and gold, the black track, the wounded and the dead. Now, Stanco is the name of the mountain itself where he fought the battle, but as Butler knew, it also means in Italian, weary, and battle fatigue pervades his poem. The poem's protagonists, the struggling soldiers, are seen as, quote, shadows who stalk in single file with clobber and kit through the drizzling rain, tackling the blasted hill again. The poem's final stanza, and my last quote from an Apennine traveller, describes a struggle to find meaning in the landscape after the day's battle. Mother, I feel that our single file is doubled now in the dark. This track is old, the mists on the world, and the hill is a question mark. Well, thanks for your attention. Sorry not to be doing this talk in person, but if you have any questions, please pass them on to Naomi and I'll be happy to answer any. Thank you.